for being here with us. It's a delight to see children in the sanctuary. And thank you to Christy, to Ian and Vicki and Evie and Libby for helping us enter a hard story today. Today we're taking up the last story we're going to address from Expecting Emmanuel by Joanna Harrider and illustrated by Michelle Burkholder. It's the story in that book called The Weeping Mothers, if you followed along in the devotional. And it can feel very far away from the wonder of Advent and the anticipation of Advent, the wonder of Christmas. But by some ways of measuring, that holiday season has just ended this past Thursday. That's the day on the liturgical calendar that celebrates Jesus' presentation at the temple as a baby. That would have occurred 40 days after Christmas and was the first time Mary was considered ritually pure after childbirth, when she could return to worship there. For that reason, it's sometimes also called the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin. In some churches, this is when candles that are going to be used in worship are blessed for the whole year. It's also conveniently halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So what I'm saying is, first, if you still have Christmas decorations up, you are just following tradition. That's just fine. And if you have kept them up, because the long nights of this time of year are hard, and you like a little bit of extra cheer at home, you could know that we have rounded the corner. We are now closer to the end of winter than we are to the start of winter, closer to the first day of spring than the first day of winter. Today I'm going to walk us through the story of the slaughter of the innocents. Sometimes it's also called the massacre of the innocents. We knew before the Magi arrived that King Herod, a Jewish king who served as a puppet of the Roman Empire, already had it out for Jesus. In fact, his plan in sending the Magi was to use them to figure out where Jesus was so he could then go assassinate him. The Magi are warned in a dream of this dastardly plan, and so go home by another way to protect Jesus, who's now a toddler, and avoid Herod. However, they don't warn Mary and Joseph of this bad news that Herod is out to kill their son. That always strikes me as a little bit odd. If they know, why not tell the parents? But anyway, in the story, Joseph is visited by an angel who warns him to take his family and flee to Egypt. The story doesn't tell us about Joseph's feelings about this, just his faithfulness to God's plan for him and his family. So off they go to Egypt. In the meantime, Herod discovers that the Magi have tricked him. The scripture says, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. Why was he furious? Obviously, his plan to kill Jesus had been thwarted, so he was angry about that, angry that this threat to his crown, a newborn king, which is how he saw Jesus, right, as a threat to his power. That threat was still out there. Now, Herod had already killed his favorite of his 10 wives, along with many other members of her family, to keep power. He killed at least 3 of his own sons for the same reason. As a client king, a puppet king of the Roman Empire, he answered to Caesar Augustus, who famously remarked that it was better to be Herod's pig than to be his son. Now, that joke is funnier in ancient Greek because the word pig and son really sound alike, but it's still pretty funny when you remember that Herod was Jewish. Caesar Augustus was not. Caesar Augustus had no problem eating pork, right? But Herod would have been prohibited from slaughtering pigs, but not prohibited from murdering his wife and sons, right? So he had a reputation far behind this Bible story. So Yes, he was on the lookout perpetually for threats to his crown, and killing one more baby boy just to keep that crown safe would not have been a problem for this guy. To know that the child was out there, though, that would have left him seething. But I think that Herod didn't just hate the fact that Jesus was alive because he feared Jesus. I think he also hated it because he hadn't gotten his way. And he hated, I imagine, the fact that the Magi knew he hadn't gotten his way. It wasn't just that Herod had lost, it was that others knew he had lost. He was defeated in the eyes of other men, wise men. Men we sometimes call kings, right? The three kings, the Magi, the wise men. Kings just like Herod. These kings knew something that Herod did not. They had a power that he did not have, and that was humiliating for him. And Herod hated that feeling. Now, here is a fact about narcissists like Herod. They have to be admired, or else they must be feared. That's how they feel about how they relate to people. And as just one example, the historian Josephus tells us that Herod was so obsessed with being mourned and so fearful that at his death, the people he had so violently ruled over would not grieve him, that at the end of his life, he sent out a call that the most distinguished men of Judea, wheresoever they lived, all across his kingdom, would report to him under penalty of death if they refused to come. Josephus tells us, now the king was in a wild rage against them all, the innocent as well as those who afforded him ground for accusation. As he nears the end of his life, he is angry with everyone, and he locks the men who report in the hippodrome, right? They follow their duty, and yet he locks them up in the stadium there in Jerusalem. He calls his sister and his brother-in-law and instructs them, I shall die in a little time. But what principally troubles me is this, that I shall die without being lamented, and without such mourning as men usually expect at a king's death. He's afraid that the people won't be sad that he dies. And Herod the Great has good reason for feeling this way. He had initiated some really remarkable infrastructure projects and public work projects, but he was also intolerably cruel. And so he directs his sister and brother-in-law to, get this, execute the men who had answered his call, one from every family, regardless of their innocence or even their loyalty to them. Herod intends for this decimation of the Jewish population to be a sign of his power, but we know that it is not. It is a sign of his weakness. A powerful king does not so desperately need the public to perform deference or worship or at his death mourning. A powerful king can tolerate criticism and dissent. But this is Herod through and through. A man with actual power. He could erect monumental buildings, including the Second Temple. He's the one who initiated the rebuilding of the temple where Mary and Joseph brought baby Jesus. I like that image of baby Jesus coming into this temple that Herod himself had overseen the building of. Herod's own little threat, the person that Herod had been looking for to kill, right there in his own building. Well, here's another way that we know Herod is actually weak. Remember, he's furious with the Magi. Matthew tells us when Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. But know what he does, or rather what he doesn't do next. Matthew tells us again, he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. That's right, he's furious with the Magi, but he doesn't go after them. Why not? We don't know why. I'm doing a little bit of imagining here. But I suspect it's because Herod doesn't take on his equals, much less those he knows to be wiser or stronger than he is. The Magi have something he doesn't, God's direction. And he knows it. This must be extra infuriating because he's actually Jewish and they're pagans. well, they're probably Zoroastrians, practice Zoroastrianism, but, right, they're not people of God. How could God be guiding them? He's the kind of man who murders children. He's not the kind of man who will take on someone he can't beat. In other words, like all bullies, he's a coward. And that cowardice makes him dangerous. Because he's a coward, he directs his anger at children. Note, though, that all of Jerusalem was nervous about this situation from the very start. Let's listen to Matthew 2, verses 1 through 3, which kick off this whole story. Matthew starts this way. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And all Jerusalem with him. We know why Herod was upset. He didn't want a new king of the Jews. But why was all of Jerusalem upset? Didn't they want a new king? That's exactly what they would have wanted. So why were they disturbed, upset, troubled, depending on what translation you read? Well, they were upset because they knew what Herod was like. They'd already seen him murder his own wife and sons. They knew that, like all bullies, he's most dangerous when he's threatened. His insecurity ruled their lives. So I think they would not have been surprised to hear his plan to slaughter all baby boys under age 2 in Bethlehem. Now, there are some historical notes, 3 notes I want to make here. First, despite Herod's command that men from every house in his kingdom be sacrificed at his death so that there would be appropriate mourning in the kingdom, his sister and brother-in-law did not follow his instructions. So that doesn't come true. Second, Herod's legacy and character are very much debated by historians. But among Christians and Jews alike, he is reviled. And I want to stress here that this story is not about Judaism trying to kill off Christianity during Jesus' infancy. We want to be very careful about not reading this in an anti-Semitic way. This guy's a villain in both Christian and Jewish traditions. The story is about how an insecure obsession with power leads people to be cruel and destructive. And third, lots of Bible scholars don't think this slaughter of the innocents ever happened. They note there are no references to it outside of Matthew, not in the other Gospels, and not in any historical documents. They argue that the story of the slaughter is a literary device. It illustrates how very evil Herod is. And it echoes the story of Moses, placing Herod in the role of Pharaoh and Jesus, baby Jesus, in the role of baby Moses, who's going to grow up to become the deliverer of God's people. It also allows Jesus to fulfill that prophecy from Jeremiah, which Evie read for us, that one day the Jews will return to Jerusalem, that their lost children will return to them, and that one day God will turn their mourning into joy. Now, other folks, though, argue that there isn't any reason to think that this story didn't happen. The murder of toddlers certainly fits with the character of Herod, and Bethlehem would have been such a small city that the murder of a dozen or so babies there wouldn't necessarily have made it into the documentation that has survived. So we can do with it what we like, I guess. I'm going to ask us to consider some perspectives on this story and its long-term impacts. I invite you to think about them and to offer some new perspectives too. This is a sensitive, difficult story, especially if you have lost a pregnancy or a child. In the typical order of life, parents and elders outlive our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren. And for those who have experienced loss on a different timeline, the grief can feel and may well be at points inconsolable. I think those who Christy mentioned at the start of worship who live in our community here in Harvey County and face such barriers to healthy pregnancies and safe childhoods. I think of all the Rachels mourning for lost children. And I remember too that though Jeremiah doesn't mention it, Rachel herself died in childbirth, a mother lost to her children. So for that reason, it may be most useful to think of the story of the slaughter of the innocents as a literary device. If it hurts too much to think about this as a true history, can we think about it as a story that points to a truth? Here are the questions I wonder about. I wonder how Joseph felt when he realized that he had saved Jesus, but with the consequence that all the other infant boys in Bethlehem were murdered. I wonder if he had wished that he'd raised an alarm when he woke from that dream where the angel warned him. Or perhaps the crime was so unimaginable he couldn't have warned anybody. And I wonder how the Holy Family were treated in Bethlehem, Joseph's ancestral home, after this. Were they ever able to return? And if they never returned, how were they remembered? Were they seen as the ones who brought a curse to the city? Or were they considered lucky because they had escaped it? I wonder how it felt for Jesus in adolescence and adulthood to be the only man his age from Bethlehem. I wonder how he faced the parents of deceased children who should have been his playmates and friends. I wonder how they saw him. Were they angry as they remembered their own losses? Did they see him as a precious reminder of their own children? Did they grieve their own sons every time they saw him? Or did they rejoice that at least one of the sons of Bethlehem, one of their boys, had survived? I wonder about the girls of Bethlehem, if they experienced survivor's guilt. How did they cope with the gender imbalance, the absence of boys? Then men, it must have been noticeable. Where did they find husbands for themselves and fathers for their children? Did they have to go outside their community to find partners? And how do you explain that? Why you're looking farther from home than you might otherwise be? Does anyone want to marry a girl from a village where this happened? I wonder about the children who lost their brothers, both younger and older. What did it mean to be an older sibling, knowing you could not protect your younger brother? Or a younger sibling, knowing only that there once was an older brother who is no more. I wonder about the mothers most of all. They would have still been nursing. How many days until their milk dries up? How did their husbands comfort them when the fathers would have been in such deep grief themselves? Some of them would have likely already been pregnant again. How did they find the will to try to keep that baby safe, knowing that safety was only a matter of Herod's mood? For women for whom this was their last pregnancy, how do you make peace with the fact that your fertility ended this way? For those for whom this was an only pregnancy, perhaps after years of praying to conceive, like Hannah and Sarah, how do you grieve not just the loss of this child, but the loss of hope for children? And I wonder about the trauma that people feel when they cannot keep their children safe. Because that is the larger purpose of Herod's actions, not merely to find the one boy who could be the newborn king of the Jews, but to remind all in his kingdom everywhere, starting in Jerusalem and extending to the edge of his kingdom, that his power was limitless over their lives. His goal was not just to murder Jesus, but to ensure that the people understood that they could never challenge the status quo, even if the challenge came in the most innocent and powerless form, the form of an infant lowly, wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger. Well, maybe this is just a story in the Bible, and we have talked enough about it to satisfy our Christian obligation to know our scriptures. But I am also talking about today, and I am also talking about our situation here in America, where children are regularly sacrificed to protect an unjust status quo. I'm talking about enslaved children being sold away from their parents to build wealth for whites. I'm talking about Indigenous children and Indigenous parents sleeping in teepees outside of the residential boarding schools where their children were forced to assimilate in white ways. You can see in this picture, teepees outside of the residential boarding school at the Pine Ridge Reservation. As Christy shared earlier, we had over 400 of these schools in the US, and of course more in Canada. I'm talking about children too young to speak, being brought before US immigration courts without any lawyer appointed to them because our court systems do not require, we are not obligated to provide counsel for undocumented people. Children separated from their parents because of inhumane immigration laws. Children 3 and 4 and 6 years old. And I'm talking about our collective ignoring of climate change because we cannot imagine an alternative to a system of capitalism that demands unsustainable consumption. This photo is from flooding in Pakistan in 2022. Flooding caused first by a heat wave, then a heavy monsoon, and the melting of glaciers in Pakistan. I'm talking about more than 10.5 million children, including about 200,000 children in the US, who have lost one or more parent or other primary caregiver, so children being raised by a grandparent, for example, due to COVID. Because we cannot admit that the work necessary to ending our ongoing pandemic will require us to rethink our healthcare and economic systems. You see on this map that the US has, we're one of the darkest red, right? You see us against India. And I'm talking about poverty and racism that create such high rates of maternal and infant mortality across the US, especially for women of color. This bar graph puts the US in context with nations we consider our peer nations. So for every 100,000 live births, we lose 23.8 women. This is dramatically different outcomes compared to our peer nations. So much so I almost can't say that we're a peer nation. And I'm talking about Tyree Nichols and about George Floyd and about every other Black man in America who called out for his mother as he was being murdered by police. I'm talking about the mothers of Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and Emmett Till, and all Black mothers before, between, and after these child martyrs to white supremacy. When we protect the most vulnerable, we necessarily protect ourselves. This is why the poet and activist Emma Lazarus wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." When we bind our future to the future of children, we can all have a future. And when we take care of their health, we take care of everyone's health. When we keep them safe, we keep all of us safe. When we secure justice for them, we secure it for all of us. The Jews living under Roman rule knew this, which is why they were so terrified of what Herod's actions meant for them. If they could not keep their own babies safe, they could not keep anyone safe. And in contrast, if we prioritize caring for the most vulnerable, the ones who cannot return the favor, then we care for everyone. For Christians, however, this solidarity with children is not merely a strategy to keep communities safe. It's also a command from Jesus, who tells us that as we treat the least of these, we also treat him. So as Christians, we should not consider it a sacrifice or a burden to care for our most vulnerable, but an act of worship. How wonderful God's kingdom really is, that we can see Jesus in the face of others, and how tragic it is when we see them and thus see him crucified to white supremacy, greed, exploitation, and racism. How easy it is then, I think, when we understand that we are protecting Jesus, just as Joseph did when he woke his wife and child and fled to Egypt. How easy it is then for us to take up this work.